Trump's New World Order in Latin America. Today we discuss. Today we are going to talk about how Trump's policies can create a new world order in Latin America. And most of this information comes from a recent article that came from the New York Post about policies regarding foreign affairs policies of Trump's administration that, of course, have derived from the incident that we have with Zelensky on the White House just a few days ago, and how it can manifest on the future foreign policy of Trump. Of course, everyone saw this particular scene, that fight, if you want to call it like that, between Trump, Zelensky, J.D. Vance on the White House, that apparently it's supposed to be just another day at the office. Zelensky was poised to sign a mineral deal that the U.S. is going to take 50% of Ukraine's natural resources in exchange for military aid, military funding, and basically military protection. But that was not what happened. We know how it ended. Zelensky basically he was kicked out from the White House. And the New York Post afterwards spoke with a source within the White House from Trump's administration, clearing out a couple of things. Apparently, the Trump administration, the US policy, is going to be that Trump and the US overall wants to avoid and left behind the issues going on in Europe, and they will like to see the European Union, the European countries, taking over this situation and handling directly instead of US taking action on such affairs, at least not directly. So I'm gonna quote very quickly this particular source of the White House. This is gonna be a part of a larger pivot away from the conflicts in Europe and a pivot towards building alliances in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere. And this comes, as I won't say it a surprise, but obviously it's, quote unquote, a pivot from the US policy to Latin America on the past 3 decades. Basically, when several administrations, both Democrats and Republicans, have ignored Latin America and they have concentrated on Middle East, Southeast Asia, of course Europe, and they had left behind everything going on in Latin America that should be their natural and geographical sphere of influence. In geopolitics, there is this term, an American term, called the Monroe Doctrine, that is America for the Americans, meaning that the whole continent, the whole Americas, should be the backyard of the United States, and they should have, let's say, some control on what's going on these countries that are geographically close to the United States, instead of other superpowers like China and Russia. This new Monroe's Doctrine 2.0 that will explain why Marco Rubio was designated as the Secretary of State by Donald Trump, that instead of his favorite, let's say, favorite closer diplomat, this particular gentleman, Richard Grenell, that he's known as the Shadow Secretary of State. He's the special envoy for several diplomatic missions. And the reason why Rubio got elected above Grenell is because first, Rubio is a Cuban American, so he speaks flawless Spanish. Also, Rubio has a great understanding of what's going on at each country in Latin America. And also, when he was a senator, he was one of the few congressmen in, on the Capitol that had a full security clearance in order to get intelligence reports from everything going on outside of the US, including Latin America. Rubio is also a China hawk. We know that Trump doesn't like China as much, and also he wants to engage on this, let's say, geopolitical tug of war between superpowers. Right now, the US and China are the biggest superpowers in the world, and Rubio is a great fit for this particular foreign affair policy of Trump in this particular war against China. Now, going back to the article by the New York Post, according to the source in the White House, the biggest beneficiaries of this pivot towards Latin America will be the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, the president of Argentina, Javier Milei, and Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader in Venezuela. And the third one is quite surprising. With Bukele, we all know the deal of Nayib Bukele, that he has become famous because the way that he tackles down the security affairs on his country, that he basically put in jail every criminal, every gang member. Remember that El Salvador was actually one of the most dangerous countries in the world, thanks to the presence of these particular gangs, the MS-13 and the MS-18. So Bukele, he tackled down this issue and put like 70,000 gang members, almost every gang member in the country, into jail. And right now, El Salvador is one of the safest places in the world, and according to some statistics, safer than Switzerland. And this particular hard line against criminality has made not only famous Bukele throughout the world, and especially in Latin America, but also Trump has been impressed. Bukele, he's a typical invite on the CPAC, the conservative conference in the United States. And just recently, Marco Rubio visited San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador, and spoke with Bukele regarding several cooperation agreements. Now let's go with Argentina and Javier Milei, that we discussed a lot the situation in Argentina, that of course, since Javier Milei, this right-wing libertarian politician, that he wasn't a politician, he was an economist. He won the election on 2023 that gave a pivot to Argentina from this particular socialism, national socialism that they had going on, and also in collaboration with left-leaning governments in Latin America. And right now, Argentina did a 180 and is free market, less taxes, less tariffs, so less bureaucracy, more free market. Also, he's famous for campaigning with a chainsaw, basically a deep public spending cuts that he did with Argentina. Remember that Argentina, the state, has a big presence on everyday's life, and Milei has been reducing both public spending and bureaucracy on Argentina on the past year and a half. And even Trump himself, just a few days ago, he mentioned the idea, and he mentioned that he's considering a free trade agreement with Argentina, something that Milei himself has spoken about a bunch of times, and he actually wants this particular deal done with the US, and it's very likely that it will happen with Trump on the White House. Now, the last case is with Venezuela and Maria Corina Machado, that she is the quote-unquote right-wing opposition leader. By far, she's basically the individual who leads the entire opposition people within Venezuela. We also have to remember that Trump is a Venezuelan hawk against the government of Maduro. And according to another source of the White House, in this particular case, we're talking with Axios, recently this particular source mentioned that they might want to cause a regime change in Venezuela. We also have to discuss the trade relationship between the Latin American countries and the US. If we see here this map, in the year 2000, the most countries in Latin America, basically every country in Latin America, the biggest trade partner was the United States. However, on 2024, we have this particular map that in most cases is China and not the United States. This is something that Trump wants to change, and we have to see which strategies Trump will implement in order to change this map from red to blue. Another thing that we had on the past few years in Latin America is that many governments come from left-leaning politicians. We have first a handful of countries that are de facto dictatorships, so they are controlled by dictatorships, not democracies. And then we have another handful of countries run by left-leaning politicians that are, let's say, evolving on authoritarian tendencies. And so this is something that Trump apparently and Marco Rubio want to handle. And several of these countries, of course, are left-leaning, so they have this anti-American or at least an anti-Trump policy. Now, you also have to remember that Florida is one of the biggest supporters of Donald Trump regarding voting and elections. Florida, just like 10 years ago, it was a swing state, so it was split between Democrats and Republicans. But since Trump actually has become a ruby red state, so many people vote for Donald Trump and the Republicans on the elections. And one of the main reasons is the Latin presence, but specifically the Cuban presence in the state. Most of them are the descendants of even themselves, are Cuban Americans that have been exiled from their country thanks to the terrible conditions of Cuba that has been run with this dictatorship that destroyed economically the country on the past 60 years. And of course, they completely hate the right now current regime in Cuba and have seen Trump on a competent ally in order to get rid of this particular, let's say, horrible situation that Cuba has been living in during the past several decades. Also, many Latinos living in the US, but specifically in Florida and also in states like Texas, that they come from countries that have been impoverished by lackluster governments in Latin America, usually, not always, countries run by left-leaning regimes, and Trump is a natural enemy to such regimes, so they want to see, let's say, some action and in order to change the situation or their home countries. And lastly, Trump wants to tackle down the several issues that come from Latin America, usually caused by lackluster governments like the migration waves and also the drug trafficking to the United States, especially fentanyl. Now, this particular pivot towards Latin America might be despite taking care of business in other areas in the world, like Eastern Europe and also the Middle East. So right now we just have to wait and see what will happen in Latin America and how Trump's policies will influence what happens on this region on the world. So, of course, we are gonna have it here on the platform. Thank you for watching Continental Insider. Please like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on social media, and if you want to work with us, continentalinsider.com. Thanks again, and have a nice day.